The title of this conference is Humans, Machines, and the Future of Work. What is work anyway? What's the contrast term? We heard yesterday that in ancient Greek social thought, the opposite of work was leisure. Paid employment was something one did out of necessity in order to have time for activities that are freely chosen. We heard yesterday about the declining labor force participation rate, which is presented to some degree as a problem. But whether and to what extent it's a problem, as economists are well aware, requires a deeper analysis. We're a rich society. To the extent that the declining labor participation rate is the result of people who have enough money to get by finding something better to do with their times than wage slavery, the declining labor participation rate may be something to celebrate. Or everyone working 15 hours a week, as going back to the quotations from Keynes. But there are other views. Paid employment can bring with it a certain social dignity, as well as a paycheck. The place of work in a good human life depends a lot on what kind of work, and the changing nature of work requires fresh analysis of its value. We'll hear something about this from Professor Satz. Debra Satz is the Martha Sutton Weeks Professor of Ethics in Society, Professor of Philosophy, and by courtesy, Political Science at Stanford University, and I'll leave off her other titles.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for being here, and thanks to Moishe and the organizers of today's event, of actually the whole conference. So we've been hearing a lot about, the changing nature of jobs, so you can think about how technology and progress. I don't think there are very many chimney sweeps. There's certainly not very many knights going around. That was once a very good form of maybe not a job, but a kind of work that people did. So there's a social science question about to what extent are technologies changing the current job structure that we have and the current jobs that are available, and what the likely results of this are going to be. And as we've been hearing, there's a range of opinion. I'm not a social scientist, and I'm not sure anyone really knows how to predict the future. So I'm not going to try to predict the future, but I am going to make one point before I turn to my topic, which is, one of the reasons prediction is so fraught is because when we're dealing with human beings and human societies, change is endogenous to choices that we make. And it's very difficult to say whether or not, for example, the populist protectionist views are going to predominate, what our institutions are going to be, what kinds of decisions we're going to make is going to affect what happens to the employment structure. And that kind of will segue into my topic, because the choices that we make inevitably involve political questions and questions about institutions, but they also concern questions about our values. We together deliberate and decide, at least ideally, on what are the values that we want to guide the use of technology in the future to the extent that we can. So this is the new employees of the month down there, but at any rate, so think about an extreme case. We can have reasons, ethical reasons, not to develop certain technologies at all. So many of you will recall that during the development of the atomic bomb, there were very, very serious debates among scientists as to whether or not these weapons should be developed. Of course, they were developed. By the time of the hydrogen bomb, those debates disappear because we've now taken it as a given. But there are right now ongoing debates among scientists about whether some experiments with viruses should be undertaken, because those experiments are seen as so dangerous and so risky that there's an ethical question whether or not we should do it. Now, there's a question, even if we decide ethically we shouldn't develop certain kinds of technologies, as people have been emphasizing, it may be politically that's not a feasible option, but at least we need to be clear in our own mind whether or not there are some technologies that are off the table. And I'm going to argue that there's some ethical values that we should be considering when we're deliberating about these kinds of questions. Now, obviously, whatever you might think about nuclear weapons, driverless cars are not like nuclear weapons in various ways, right? Assuming that they work well. They have potentially some very good social effects. Presumably in the long run, they'll be cheap. That could lead to lower prices. It could lead to certain kinds of work that people prefer not to engage in, that are stressful or dangerous or boring, being taken off the table. How dangerous driving is, we heard yesterday, maybe it's not as dangerous as people think, but clearly there is costs to human driving. If it were the case that robots eliminated, driverless cars eliminated some of these costs, that has to be put on the ledger as a positive factor. We humans make mistakes. I have a 17-year-old son who is driving. I can tell you I have been wishing for driverless cars, but they're not here fast enough. So there are some definite advantages, and of course we can always ask, aren't attempts to block technologies just mechanisms for impeding the satisfaction of consumer preferences and stifling various kinds of good results? And there's a famous quote by the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick: "It's wrong to forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults," right? So people want to make these trades, who are we to interfere with them? But obviously, there are other kinds of considerations, and we've heard a little bit about this. And again, I'm not going to predict what is going to happen, but there is the possibility that new technologies will cause various kinds of harms, either especially to third parties who are neither owners of the new technologies nor affected primarily as consumers. So if you think about driverless cars, obviously one of the large groups that will be affected are drivers, and particularly people who drive for a living. And it's reasonable to think that these people will bear costs. Again, whether or not those costs are worth it, whether or not, depends in part on what our values are, and then whether we have social institutions in place that can deal with the harms from the new technologies in ways that reflect our values. So let me talk about three kinds of harms, and I'll use the case of driverless cars just as an illustration. But they're the kinds of harms we have to think about. So as I said, new technologies go back to the Knights, will put some people out of work. There's pain as the result of innovation, and the pain is not distributed equally. It will hit some people harder than others, and whether or not we can address that pain, we have to at least start by recognizing that it exists. Lower communications and monitoring costs have made outsourcing, subcontracting, and offshoring much easier. Algorithmic scheduling has left baristas and fast food workers without predictable hours. And all of these changes have made work more precarious and further sever the ties of loyalty and voice between workers and companies. So this is just a change. I'm not evaluating the change, but note that there's a change in the very structure of work that's occurring because of the new technology. Also, as I have alluded to, and I'll come back to this, today's workers are unlikely to have stock in the new technologies. Workers tend to lack capital for investment, and inequalities in capital ownership, and this is a point that Friedman made yesterday, have been a driving force behind rising inequality. So workers aren't likely to own the robots or software that replace them and disempower them, but other people will. And the workers may or may not be retrained for other positions. So maybe there are harms and we can address them, but maybe those harms are not going to be addressed and those costs not taken into account. So here are my harms. So one, and I think Moishe started us off by looking at, for white workers, white working class men, not college educated, there's been a tremendous decline in employment. So that's a cost to a particular set of workers. But there are other costs. There are two other costs I want to mention of new technologies. So sometimes the substitution of machines for people is actually not what consumers themselves prefer. So take Meals on Wheels. Meals on Wheels could be delivered by drones. Now, maybe some people would like that. They don't really want to talk to people, but lots of people actually want human contact. And so search engines can speed up the task of finding books and articles. That's fantastic. I use it all the time. But sometimes I miss the fact that there's no longer like an expert in the bookstore who actually knows anything about books. And, you know, where there's a mix of product and human service that are intertwined, it may be that the market left by itself won't deliver what people actually want. So sometimes the consumers may not get what they want, and so we may, again, need to think about how we would address this. You know, and obviously one way is to think about the Meals on Wheels by drones as a complement to Meals on Wheels by people, but that may not emerge naturally from the market. We may have to do something. And finally, the third thing is there can be some long-term societal harms from the choices we make regarding technology. So whatever an attitude you take about technology, there's some path dependence. Once you start down various kinds of roads, some skills are lost. I doubt any of you can ride a horse and, I don't know, take a lance and effectively fight battle. But at one time, people could do that. So one of technology's most prominent critics, Nicholas Carr, argues that a lot of technology, rather than enhancing skills, degrades skills. We can debate on balance, what's the result, but clearly some skills are lost. I think one of his most interesting examples is about airplane pilots. So he argues that because pilots now fly their planes largely using automation, now there's a good part of that. It makes airplane travel safer, and that's a huge benefit. But it also means that pilots have less experience actually, they spend less time actually flying planes. We might not care about that because in the end all we care about is the safety, but we should notice that a skill is being lost. So maybe on balance these changes are good, maybe they're not. We can argue about that, but we have to pay attention to the fact that technology has implications for the distribution of skills in society. Even beyond examples of individual skill erosion, new technologies can also affect the structure of power and ownership in society. So my bookstore example, I use Amazon, but there are many, many less bookstores around than when I was a kid. We have a kind of winner-take-all. Technology has made possible returns, right, to a very few, like artists, musicians, that were unheard of before you had things like records and CDs, and that can change the structure of a profession. And again, maybe in good ways, maybe in not good ways. Some of the distribution that some of the changes that affect the structure of work have to do with the rise of casual labor with much less bargaining power of voice than in the past. So there may be good things, again, about work flexibility, but it's clear that the new organization of the, quote, gig economy makes it much harder for workers to organize, denies voice to them since there's really no group to exercise voice. And network platforms give firms like Uber tremendous power to drive down compensation for workers or to terminate them without due process. And so this is just a kind of fundamental point. Let's see. It's unemployment. Oh, that's a Meals on Wheels type example. And I'm trying to get to here, my big point. We're not only shaping, but we're also shaped by the new technologies. And so because technological development isn't a fact of nature, it doesn't just happen. It depends on social institutions and values and government action or inaction. It depends on issues like taxation, education and training, unionization, unemployment benefits, because all of these things are either causes or effects of technological change. They're not facts of nature, and we can influence how technology develops to some extent. Our powers are pretty limited. I don't want to overestimate the human powers to predict or shape the future, or a lot of things happen and we can't really control them, but technology is not totally in the driver's seat. We still have some ability to shape and act. And I really want to stress that because it's not just the development of technology and its speed that we can affect the direction of technology. And I'm going to talk a little bit about trying to change some of the incentives about the ways that technology develops, shifting it away from labor-saving technology to resource-conserving technology is one possible, but I'll get to that in a minute. So now I'm going to get to my main topic, which is, here's another way that we can lose certain skills. All right. So I'm going to argue that there are three basic values that should be guiding our response and policies with respect to managing the changes in technology that threaten work. And those are well-being, autonomy, and equality. You'll notice it's not a long list of values. There are probably other things you could think of. What about privacy? You could put privacy under well-being. So I'm going to think of these as somewhat, encompassing, but they're not meant to be it's not meant to be an exhaustive list. But here are I think, three key, normative concerns that we should be assessing different kinds of policy responses we might have to technology. So let me say something about each of these values in turn. So what's well-being? Well, lots of definitions and well-being, but just roughly, well-being has to do with what makes people's lives go well, what contributes to their living a flourishing life, and we can try to get a handle on this or try to decompose it by looking at such measures as a person's ability to be economically effective, to be healthy, and to form personal relationships. So we can use rough proxies, which people have developed to determine how people are doing. So we look at things like GDP, not a perfect proxy, but a proxy. We look at longevity. We look at infant mortality. We look at education. We look at rates of marriage and divorce. And we try to figure out how are people doing? And, are there things that make people better along these metrics or worse along these metrics? And in general, we think promoting improvements on these metrics is something that we can use to assess policy. And, we're doing not so good on some metrics and a lot better on others. So here's life expectancy doesn't look so great if you're an American male compared to European or Japanese males. Well-being in terms of GDP looks pretty good. So that's a measure we're doing pretty well in. Incarceration, not so good, right? So, we can say, look, there are, we could improve our well-being scores, and one of the things we'll want to think about when we're thinking about policies and thinking about technological changes, are they making us better in terms of these, indicators, or are they making it worse? And in the context we're considering today, I think what's important is for most people, not everybody, but for most people, work, at least when it's not degrading or damaging to their health, is an important component of their well-being. So studies have shown, now here I'm thinking about subjective well-being, and of course subjective well-being is not, there are a lot of objections to using that, but it's the metric, one of the main metrics that we have. One of the things that studies have found is that people prefer being able to work even in cases when they could have the same income, right, without the possibility of work. So these are these old studies by Andrew Oswald, is one person who's done work on this. When you look at what it is that, from subjective reports of well-being, takes the biggest hit out of people's sense of satisfaction with their lives, the two biggest hits are divorce and unemployment. So that's significant if we're thinking about costs, right? And I'll come to why income is not a perfect substitute for unemployment. We should hold this factor in mind. So we can think of well-being, I was going to draw a curve, so it's probably some kind of curve that flattens towards the top of the curve at some point, between $50 billion and $51 billion, or $50 million and $51 million. The bang for the buck in well-being probably is not as much as between, $1,000 and $2,000. So we can think of it as flattening, and we could probably think that there's some level beneath which, right, a person, really doesn't have adequate well-being to function as a member of society, right? Adam Smith had this famous, wonderful line about the ability to appear in public without shame, right? That there's some kind of set floor, which when people fall below, right, they're sort of off the, we should never let anybody fall below that level. Now, if well-being were the only issue at stake in automation, then we could just evaluate different policies by how they affect well-being. So we'd look at GDP, we could look at subjective measures of satisfaction, and so on. But unfortunately, matters are more complex. There are a bunch of values that are at stake in automation, and well-being is not the only value. So I'm going to, as I said, there are two other values I want to talk about. So the second value is autonomy. We heard a lot about robot autonomy. I'm not going to talk about robot autonomy here. I'm going to say that whereas well-being is a value that's focused on outcomes, autonomy focuses on the processes that produce the outcomes. And for most of us, we care about the way that we achieve our well-being. We don't want it just handed to us. Maybe that would itself diminish the well-being, but even if it didn't diminish the amount of well-being, we actually care that some of the outcomes are obtained by our own choices. We want to be in a position to be good choosers, to be sure that our choices are tracking appropriately what we have reason to value. There are, two famous examples. So you probably know the story of the fox and the grapes. The fox is very happy not being able to get the grapes since he's decided they're sour. I don't want to be in the position of that fox. I want to know that what I care about or what I prefer, I have reason, right, to prefer what I do. I'm not just adapting myself mindlessly to my circumstances. So even if I could be really happy, staying at home and doing, not very much, I might have reason not to worry about if that was just adaptive to my circumstances. And a second famous example for getting at autonomy, although I think this intuition has started to change. When I first started teaching and I would raise this with my students, they all got this, and now they actually, well, I'll try it with you. Robert Nozick asks us to imagine, this is his argument that subjective well-being isn't the only thing that matters. If you could be hooked up to a machine for the rest of your life and be really happy and be given all the experiences, you're just hooked up to the machine, most people in the old days would say they don't want to be hooked up to the machine. They would rather have, some unhappiness in life, but have it actually be, right, the product of their own actions. Now my students are increasingly saying they would take the machine. Maybe this itself is an adaptation to the technological change. But if you don't want to be hooked up to the machine, it's because in some way you think it's not just outcomes, it matters how the process of those outcomes is achieved, and you want whatever happiness or you get to somehow reflect, things that you do. Okay. So, and one of the things about autonomy is it not only focuses us on the conditions for choosing, but autonomy is only meaningful when people have robust sets of choices, right? So, your money or your life is a choice, right? I make a bunch of decisions and motivation, and I choose to save my life and not pay the money, but most of us would say, look, that's, that choice set is not appropriate. Either it's, somehow illegitimate or it's too narrow. You need more choices. So for most people concerned about autonomy, they are concerned not only with the process of choosing, but that people actually have a robust set of choices. So if our choices got so narrowed, that would be a concern. And finally, there's equality, and we've talked a little bit about it. And equality, you can value equality for a different variety of reasons. There's not only one reason to be concerned about, let's say, high rates of inequality of well-being or income, or so there are instrumental reasons. So some people have said inequality is linked to various kinds of social ills. I think on the list of that Joel put up, a couple of the social ills, some people argue, have to do with inequality. Obesity is one where there's been, some work on health and inequality. There are debates about this. How much is inequality? How much is poverty? But, Joe Stiglitz, in his recent book, links inequality to increased crime, teenage pregnancy, lack of social cohesion. There are a whole bunch of things that people have said are connected to inequality. So you might worry about increased social ills, and there are connection to well-being. Been a lot of work recently that large inequalities, especially in income and wealth, are associated with unequal opportunity for political influence. It's a big concern about institutions and the health of our democracy. So you might care if changes in the structure of work lead to large inequalities that influence the political process. That is another instrumental reason for being concerned. And third, you might worry that large inequalities undermine equality of opportunity, which is a widely shared value. It's very hard to say that we're all each other's equals if the playing field is so slanted that some people don't really have the opportunity to compete. So that would be a third instrumental reason for caring about inequality. And finally, there are some intrinsic reasons to be concerned about equality or be concerned with inequality. And that is if you think that some kinds of inequality are just unfair, right? Not because they lead to bad results, but because in some sense they fail to treat citizens as equals. They put us in demeaning relations with one another. This is a kind of Rawlsian view, right? That if you think of society as a cooperative arrangement for producing certain benefits, you might think prima facie then citizens have an equal claim on the benefits they collectively produce, and there's an intrinsic unfairness to inequalities. So that's multiple value, so that's equality. And so given that there are three values that I have identified here, it'd be an amazing piece of luck if the same policies tended to produce the maximum amount of benefit along these three parameters. So we know that sometimes promoting welfare can increase inequality, right? So we have trade-offs to make. And one thing you could imagine doing then is thinking of these three values as giving you the basis of a scorecard, where you could score along these different dimensions, different policy options, and see whether they improve on some dimension, maybe they aren't so good on another dimension, and then we'll have to each, assess, and this is what we do then in a democracy, we'll assess and argue about the relative weights to give the different values, and some political party representing one view of this will win, and then we're off and running. Okay, so what I want to do is use these three values to push back a little against one policy prescription that is often raised. It's become very popular in Silicon Valley to concerns about technology displacing work. And that's the idea of a basic income, and we heard a little bit about that the other day. Sometimes this is called a UBI, a universal basic income. So here's Martin Ford in The Rise of the Robots. In my view, the most effective solution is likely to be some form of basic income guarantee. So here's what you can do. People are unemployed, and one of the things you can do is pay everybody some kind of basic income. You can either pay a universal basic income, that's to everybody. Some people talk about a participatory basic income. I think that's Atkinson's idea, which is you only get the basic income if you participate in some way in the economy. But the universal basic income is the view that is, as I say, in policy circles, at least the ones that I've been traveling in, increasingly put forward as a policy solution to problems about, either temporary or permanent unemployment. And the policies range, so they range from, what level the basic income is set at, I've heard everything from about $4,000 per person up to about $12,000 a person. There's a lot of disagreement about what would be the right level. There's some experiments going on, both in different countries. In my own state, Oakland is now experimenting with a basic income. But one attractive feature of a basic income is it's supported by people on both the left and the right. It seems to have wide support. Somebody put up a chart yesterday with a list of the names of people who've been supporting the basic income. And it's across the political spectrum. Milton Friedman was an early proponent in the form of a tax credit. And it's clear that a basic income would do something for some of the dimensions that I mentioned, right? So you could think on the well-being side, it might help people maintain a level of well-being without relying on a job. On the autonomy side, it would give people an alternative, so it would add to the set of alternatives. So you don't want to engage in mind-numbing work, here's an option. Actually, having an exit option can strengthen voice, because if you can exit, then that gives you some ability to shape, the negotiation. And it might make some dent in inequality, again, depending on what level the basic income is set at. But I think there's some reasons to be concerned about it from the point of view of the values that I talked about. So the first I just want to start with is the idea that a basic income will address some kinds of welfare losses, but not others. And so going back to the idea that work is a particularly important particularly important as a source of meaning and self-respect for people, that people get a lot of their identity, their community. Now, we might imagine we could change that, but in the world today, for people who are unemployed, many of them are isolated. They're, many people want to work. And so even if you could replace the income lost from unemployment with a basic income, which would be at a level no one is really suggesting, but even if you could do that, there's some forms of loss that wouldn't be compensated for. I think that's something that if we're thinking about welfare, we have to take into account the idea that people get a source of meaning. Now, maybe jobs are changing, so there was this idea of jobs as a calling, and, I don't live in so much of a bubble that I don't, I realize that for many people, work, has a lot of negatives associated with it. It can be demeaning and backbreaking and mind-numbing. But even work that many of us think of as work we wouldn't want to do, actually it can be a source. There's a lovely book, There's No Shame in My Game, which is a study of fast food workers in New York, and it talks quite movingly in interviews about the sense of community and meaning. The people who work in this, it's I think a Burger King, get, and actually the complexity of the tasks that they do. So I don't think we should, how am I doing? 3 minutes? Okay, I'm only halfway done. All right, I've been dragging on. All right, I'll speed up. Okay, in the second place, a UBI doesn't do anything to address the disempowering of workers in the economy. So if you care about the inequality, if you care about worker voice, if you care about, the insecurity of people's employment, the UBI doesn't do anything to make, work more meaningful or give people more say or control or autonomy with respect to the kinds of work they do. And third, while putting a threshold under people can help with inequality, it's compatible with large amounts of inequality over the minimum. And so there's a question about how much social inequality, and again, for instrumental reasons or for intrinsic reasons, you might care about that. I'll skip over the use of the fairness objection, and then I want to say we have other options besides UBI that I think should be part of the toolkit for thinking about how we respond to changes in technology. So one is, you might call this, I don't know if it's pre-distribution as opposed to redistribution, but government has played a large role in innovation. And one of the things government might do is try to influence the direction of innovation. Now, a lot of people are going to be very nervous about this, maybe particularly now, about the government. But as I said, when we allow, because the decisions have fallen more and more to private hands and private, very powerful hands, a lot of technological development is labor saving, because that's cost saving, but not resource saving. And society has an interest in resource saving technologies. Now, some of the resource saving technologies will also be labor saving, so it's not that these are two totally separate categories, but we might work on incentivizing technologists to be in the business of thinking about saving resources as opposed to saving jobs. As opposed to losing jobs. It's also the case that, as people have talked about, there's some skills that are less easily replaced by machines, and we might really invest in job training for workers to be involved in service or caring work, which is harder to do with machines. Third, as I mentioned, there's some services the market can't be expected to supply on its own. If we're really interested in machines as complements and not as substitutes to labor, then we have an interest in, for example, maintaining the option for people who don't want a machine delivering their meals on wheels to have some other form of provision, so we can think about other kinds of provision beyond that done by the market. And then we can commit to ending involuntary unemployment. So maybe we can't have zero unemployment, but maybe we can really work at making sure that people who want to work have the opportunity to work at decent jobs. We can think about a commons, thinking about creating more public good and publicly owned. And then that kind of leaves me with this issue that has come up before about, to the question, who owns the robots? The answer should be, in part, they belong to us all, right? So that the technology might be fine, but the ways the technology is deployed and the question of who benefits from the technology, that's something we can control. And so there are reasons to think about experimenting with different forms of ownership of the technology. And I will stop there. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. Please.
Hello. Thank you for the comments, Dr. Satz. I have two, I think, troubling questions that bother me. And I was interested that you started with well-being, autonomy, and equality, because part of me was thinking, okay, we need to be able to focus on values that are most material to the question of how automation and AI and robotics specifically impinge upon values or help values. And I feel like there's subsets of those that you mentioned that are so relevant to those that I need to mention them, things like human self-identity or information ownership or privacy, conviviality or dignity in labor, which are really subsets of some of the ones you talked about. But I have a bigger concern, which is that your talk, to a great degree to me, and I'm an imposter in ethics, was Kantian or character-based. In a way, it was about fundamental character traits. And the concern I have with that approach is that most every engineer I know, and that engineer class is the people who are, in fact, in a way, driving the future technologies and therefore deciding how our values change. The engineers I know, if they're even mindful about ethics, are highly consequentialist in nature. So we need to do a kind of a translation service. The only way to affect them, I think, is not to talk about quality of life writ large, but about how the decisions they can make about what to invent will specifically change and narrate how people's quality of life changes in a consequential or utilitarian way. And I'm worried that we miss the boat if we don't educate them on ways to think mindfully about ethics in a way that's actually material to the decisions they make about what to invent and what to not invent. So I'm curious about your thoughts there.
Okay, thank you. So I didn't mean my discussion of the values to, take character theory. In fact, you could be a consequentialist and, think all these three values matter. And the reason that they matter is because of the effects of these values. So well-being is an obvious one that has a very consequentialist, it's forward-looking, like what can we do to produce, better scores on well-being for Americans or, whatever the set of population that we're looking at. And so how does technology advance well-being? That's a consequence. We can also think, how does technology affect our abilities, to make choices in the set of choices that we confront? That also can be. So all of these, you could be consequentialist about inequality. So nothing I was saying really has to do with, it's character only in that I'm saying we should be concerned when we should see ourselves as making choices, and we should be concerned that some of our choices are have normative elements, that they involve values. And I gave the example of the, debate that's going on. I have colleagues at Stanford in biology who are very involved in these debates about risky experiments. Are there some experiments we should simply not conduct because they're too risky? Now, you could tell a consequentialist story. It's really dangerous. Some technologies are really dangerous. Nuclear weapons are clearly an example of a very dangerous innovation. Maybe we'll destroy, life on Earth. And so that's a big cost. So that has a character part. If you don't care about values, nothing I've said is going to make you care about these values. This is just saying, here are three values I think are at stake in the decision. Now, if you don't care about them, that's not going to move you. But most people, I think, care. They want their decisions at least not to be unethical. And so, anyway, hope that answers.
Bob?
Yeah, I think you're in danger of getting into the situation where people are talking past each other, because your values are not necessarily the values of a conservative. Their values would be things like serving God, an orderly, lawful community, serving the country, you're a follower of Jeremy Bentham, and not everybody is.
Yeah. I'm not a follower of Jeremy Bentham.
Talking past people.
I'm not quite a follower of Jeremy Bentham, but I take the point, right? So I'll say a couple of things. There's a much larger discussion to have, again, about the fact that people disagree on values, right? So not everybody shares all the same values. There are questions about, when you turn to the political realm, about, what are the kinds of values that have a place in public life, which are values that might be inappropriate for majorities to impose on public life. So that's a long discussion. I'll retreat by simply saying even most conservatives, I actually think, autonomy may be more problematic, but well-being, they may have different views about well-being and what gives well-being, but they are concerned about people's well-being. Some conservatives are concerned about autonomy, and then of course people disagree about inequality. So, I mean, I'm not mandating these. People will say, I don't care about equality, I care about well-being. That's the only value I care about. If I were Bentham, that's what I would say. I only care about well-being. But I'm putting this out, and then it's for other people to say, you know what, I don't see the reason why you're advocating these three values. I think there's only one value at stake, and then we have a discussion.
These are not necessarily matters of reason.
Well, that gets into something that was said yesterday. There is the view that ethics is just subjective and it's just a matter of your opinion. This is, maybe just defense of the profession. I don't believe it's just a matter of opinion. I think there are better and worse ways of reasoning about values, that we've learned things, that there's actually a fair amount of convergence on, that even, across the political spectrum, people are not going to be defending genocide or defending, killing innocent babies. And, we shouldn't trivialize the amount of convergence in human life that we've achieved on some fundamental values, and I think that's a good thing. There's still lots of room for reasonable disagreement. I take that point. And not everybody's going to be convinced. Not everybody's going to be convinced about the values, and then even when people are convinced, they're going to disagree about the weights. So for some people, autonomy is not that weighty a value, right? Maybe it gets a little weight, but it's well-being that really matters. For other people, well-being, if I were a Kantian, I might say well-being isn't that important. What really matters is the autonomy. So there's going to be disagreement about the weights. That's not surprising that we disagree about a lot of things.
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much for everything. Just a question, what is your position regarding Europe? Because we talk a lot, because I'm French, and I see what is the problem today. Like, the big values like equality, it was a big changes in France, for instance, because we are a country with redistribution everywhere. So it means if we have people who earn more money, we can redistribute everywhere. It's like that for many years. Now it's a big challenges because most of the election parties wants to change that in 6 months in France, and it will be the same in all of Europe. So I don't know if I don't know what to think about equality today, because more and more schools are not free in France. Mm-hmm. The social security is more private in France. And I was in Mongolia and in China a few months ago, and most of the young generation are thinking that communism is maybe the best thing ever, and capitalism will be the worst thing. So I don't know what to think today.
Everybody's asking me really easy questions. I gave some instrumental and intrinsic reasons to care about the extent of inequality, but poverty is also a harm to people, and one of the things that the example of China is particularly a kind of poignant example, because China has probably done more in the world today to decrease extreme poverty than in a rapid time than any other place we've known, at the very same time that inequality in the world is growing. And so there are questions about how you think about, so some people think there's a trade-off between, I think less people are as sure as they used to be that there's an inevitable trade-off between growth and inequality. But clearly there can be some trade-offs, and then we have to decide between growing an economy that raises the level of the poor and increasing inequality. If that were the choice we were faced, we would have to wait, and make decision about those. I don't think that's necessarily the choice we face, and I'm not going to talk about France, but I don't think it's the choice we face in the United States. I think that there are things that we could do that could both, again, I'm not a social scientist, and the social scientists may tell me this wouldn't be a stable solution, but I think we could do things that would make a dent on poverty and a dent on inequality.
Okay, on
And
that
I'll
note,
close it on that happy note.
yeah, thank you. We have a coffee break at the event hall, and please come back at 11:10. Thank you.